really sure what to say about.
Yeah.
Okay, we are live, and we're joined this hour by Joseph Orozco, who is a professor, a writer, an author. We're really, really excited to be joined this hour. So, Joey, before we get started in talking about some of the work that you've been putting out over the years, can we talk? Can we start at the beginning? Can you tell us a little bit about your academic journey and how that began?
Well, thanks, Matt. Let me just say at the start of it all that I'm really honored to be part of this project that you're doing, and I'm enthusiastic about the speed that you've been doing this and just the voices that you've collected. This is quite an amazing sort of effort that you're doing. So, congratulations and thank you for all your work on this. So me, I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and so I've been here now for almost 20 years or so. It's a little bit of a sort of an odd thing. I'm one of perhaps like a handful, maybe 10 or so Mexican American Chicanx professors in philosophy. And one thing is that I'm a full professor, so I'm fully tenured and I've gone through all the ranks of the professoriate. So I'm at the top of the pyramid. And if you look at the makeup of all like professors in the United States, the number of people who are Latinx at that level is minuscule. So I recognize that I have a certain kind of privilege and responsibility because of where I am as a Chicano professor in philosophy, of all places, in the U.S. Academy. But I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I was born in Quito, Ecuador. My mother was, she's originally from New Mexico. Our family has been in New Mexico for, forever now, right? Doing some of this DNA ancestry kinds of stuff. I've found my indigenous heritage, and so we go back to Diné Navajo folk here in this area for generations, thousands of years, and so we've been in New Mexico for a long, long time. I grew up in Albuquerque, and I'm not sure exactly what got me started in thinking philosophically. But I remember from very early ages being really interested in the subject matter of philosophy, like these questions about like who are we? What is our purpose here? Like, what is society all about? And how can we create a better kind of world? These things were always really fascinating to me. And it ties into another thing, which I'll talk about later, but my interest in science fiction and science fiction worlds. But initially I was kind of interested in these questions about just existence. And so my mother was a very gracious person. She was the first of her family to get a college education. And this is at the time in the late 1960s, early 70s, where there was the Chicano movement pushing for access for people into higher education. So my mother was a beneficiary of those kinds of struggles. And so she went to UNM and University of New Mexico, and then decided to do some study abroad in Quito, Ecuador, where she met my father. So I was born down there, even though I don't have any recollection of it all. But I grew up in Albuquerque, trying to make sense of these kinds of problems. My mother indulged me with all of these kinds of books about philosophy, and it really just got me started. So I majored in philosophy in college at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and then decided that I wasn't really good at anything else, and so I had to pretty do this academic thing, and so I became a professor, and I've been teaching philosophy now at Oregon State for about 20 years. My main area of focus is in political and social philosophy, and so I teach classes in sort of classical Western European philosophy, but one of my specializations is also Latin American and Latinx political thought. And so I'm one of the founding members of an organization that got started in the last 5 years or so called the Society for Mexican American Philosophy. In the past few years, there's been sort of like a core group of enough of us of Chicanos and Chicanx folk who are in positions of professors of philosophy. And we've always had this kind of interest in thinking about our culture, our history, our people, but this is not something that's studied in philosophy, at least. And so we've always felt very isolated, but there's been a core group of us that have grown up over the past, say, 10 years. And we've decided that we want to make room in the world of philosophy for the study of Mexican-American Chicanx thought, because there's a long legacy of this kind of stuff in the Chicanx movement, right? In the early 1970s, there was a handful of folks who were Chicanx philosophers, and they're often not talked about. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion about how a lot of folks who are doing Chicanx philosophy were kind of pushed out of the field of the Chicanx movement in favor of people who were doing things like literature or social science or things like this. But the people who were in these kinds of humanities fields often started to get marginalized, to the point at which those few Chicanx philosophers who were there in the 1970s got forgotten, got dispersed. And then the focus of organizations like Knox and all these things turned into literature and social science kinds of emphases. So part of what we've been trying to do in the past 4 years is to try to make room once again for Chicanos and Chicanas, Chicanx folk in philosophy, and trying to archive those early philosophers and making connections to Mexican philosophers. There's a long legacy of Mexican philosophical thought, and then Latin American philosophical thought. So that's one of the projects that I've been really happy about in the last few years, is trying to connect our culture, our movements, our social political thought with larger sorts of conversations, and trying to figure out, like, are there kinds of resources in Chicanx thought that can be useful for helping to think about social, political, and then even existential kinds of issues that exist in the world today. So I'm trying to figure out, like, what's the way in which our community's collective wisdom can be thought of as a resource for solving problems in the world. And so that's a little bit of the sort of intellectual journey that I've taken for it, and where my thought has been going. But my other sort of big interest in the past few years has been science fiction. And so I will talk a little bit about that later on. But
Yeah.
a lot of my sort of recognition, my orientation of where I am, I always have to be grateful. And I've seen some of your other interviews, particularly with Alejandro Gradia, and I was really grateful about what he said about this, is that I acknowledge that where I'm at and the place that I have is because of generations of struggle from the Chicano movement, and that I would not have been able to get into the kinds of institutions that I was able to go to if it had not been for those generations of students who got my mother into university, and then later me into higher education. And so I have to give this kind of honor to those ancestors who did that hard work of really challenging what higher education should mean. And like the old sort of Plan de Santa Barbara used to talk about, right? The sort of founding document for Mecha, right? The goal of that part of the movimiento was to try to figure out how to connect the university with the barrio, right? How do we make the barrio and the university work in such a way so that the knowledge of the university can be useful to solve issues and problems in the barrio, and that people who are growing up in our communities see the university as a place that they can go, not to aspire for kind of careerist purposes, right? Not for escaping from the barrio, but for trying to become professionals with knowledge and wisdom that can be useful then for coming back to the barrio and trying to deal with problems and solutions in it. So I think that that's a vision that's always really shaped my intellectual purpose, is that kind of sense of responsibility. And I think that, in the controversies we've seen over things like Mecha over the past 2 or 3 years, there's a new sense of activism growing, and I'm not always sure that I understand the need to sort of call out and dump on the ancestors in some sorts of ways. I understand critique and criticism are always important, but there's a new sort of movement going on, and I'm not always sure that I understand the the kind of analysis that's going on that
Yeah.
wants to disconnect us from that kind of history. But I think that it's important for me to recognize that struggle, and then also, as Gradia said, to recognize important kinds of policy things like affirmative action. I'm proud to say that, you know, I got into graduate school through an affirmative action scholarship at the University of California, Riverside. There used to be this graduate fellowship for specifically students of color. It doesn't exist anymore after all of the California measures to get rid of affirmative action, but I benefited from that. I probably benefited a little bit from affirmative action and getting into Reed College, right? Those kinds of things. So for me, this has always been not a source of shame or something, or I've never doubted, you know, my place in higher education as a result of that. Instead, I say that it's important that institutions be flexible to be able to recognize different kinds of strengths, different kinds of experiences beyond just simply grades and letters of recommendation and all this stuff. And quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are in higher education who are simply there because their parents were rich. And so, you know, if that's going to be the game that we play, then let's struggle to open it up to recognize other kinds of backgrounds and experiences. And I think that was a really important kind of thing, that what happened in the 60s and 70s was creating those kinds of projects to make that space open for people. And that made, you know, things available for folks like my mother and for me. And so whenever I talk to students about affirmative action, I'm always forward and I say, look, we're going to talk about these kinds of issues. And I want you to know that I am a recipient of these kinds of benefits, and I'm here today to talk about them. And I have no doubts about my competency to be here.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, our position in society is based on bloodshed and murder, though. So I mean, that's not like that's. So the idea that, like, I'm glad that Gradia said that. I'm glad that you have said that. That, like, you know, I'm proud to, like, that my position in society was afforded to me because people sacrificed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That should never have been the case. Like, it should have been the case that you grew up kind of a nerd. I'm messing with you, but you know, and you want to read, and you want to read books, and you want to talk about the books you read, and you want to write your own books, right? And society should be opened up to you to be able to do that. Period.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these questions of the fact that you grew up in Albuquerque, you're Mexican Ecuadorian. I mean, that should not have been something that was something that had to be overcame. You know, and the fact, I mean, these are things we have to overcome that we should not have to overcome. And so when people want to talk about affirmative action, I mean, like, yeah. But I want to talk about Reed, because I've spoken to Reed, and Reed is an interesting place.
Yeah.
I remember. I want to ask. I remember when I was there, they had when I went and spoke there, they had this. It was the most clear example of what I was like, oh my God, what am I looking at? They had this thing called the scrounge, where people would like throw their leftover food and they would eat each other's leftover food.
Yep.
And these are like trust fund kids, like pretending to be poor.
Yeah.
So what was what was it like to be there for 4 years?
Yeah, you know, that was an odd experience. I mean, for people who don't know, Reed College is a private liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon, and it has a reputation of being, you know, sort of a little off the wall, a little really academically intense, and students being sort of, you know, either socially awkward or brilliant geniuses. And that's what I found out. Right, is that it was an academically intense place. I mean, that was the hardest academic work that I ever did, even more so than all of my graduate work. Graduate school was a breeze after what happened to me at Reed. So it was a good sort of academic training camp. I call it academic boot camp for graduate school. But socially speaking, it's a mess. It's, you know, it's you do have all of these really intense people. And a lot of them are very privileged, upper class white folk from New England and California. And so they have grown up with a lot of privilege. They're really whip smart. But socially speaking, right, all of the kinds of senses of entitlement that come with privilege like that is apparent there. And so there's a lot of neuroticism. There's a lot of unhealthy behaviors. Every year that I was there, I mean, this is a bad thing that people talk about, but it's true. Every year that I was there, someone overdosed on heroin in one of the dorms. Right, and so a lot of privilege, but also there's a lot of pain in those kinds of communities because I think that their lives are just so empty, right? And so there was a lot of kind of intensity in that kind of way, and so I think it makes people very, in some ways, kind of socially neurotic in a way with one another. So for me, Reed was very academically intense. I learned a lot. I learned how to think. It formed me in that kind of way and introduced me to ways of thinking that I don't think I ever would have been able to do. But it was very sort of narrow too in its focus. I mean, it was very sort of Western European kinds of senses of focus. And I never got to read Latino authors. I never got to read any Latin American philosophers or any kind of thing like that. Anything that happened like that, I had to do myself. And it's the same thing in graduate school. And I went to UC Riverside. Never any kind of thing in terms of Latinx or Latin American philosophy. All of that stuff I taught myself how to do.
Yeah.
And so my academic journey is one in which I've had to make room for myself in those spaces because it wasn't going to be offered for me. And lately, I know that students at Reed have been trying to really push to change curriculum to be able to get away from the dead white males of the Western canon and all that kind of stuff, and doing some work. And there's some good reason to do that, I think. But Reed is an intense place with intense people, and a lot of people who want to kind of play at being radical and poor. Right, they want to pretend that they're working class and are down with the struggle, but they are, like you said, trust fund folks who, if they fall, they have big cushions to fall upon. And so I recognize that my sort of college experience was vastly different than a lot of folks who might have gone to, a public university or something like that. So I recognize that I got really lucky to be able to be in the halls of privilege like this, but to see that it was something that those were not folks that I wanted to be like.
Yeah, I mean, no, but it's just I'm not giving them shit for just having rich parents or whatever. I mean, like depends what you do with things. And I'm not someone just to like walk up to somebody and start giving them shit unless they do something. But the fact of the matter is, you're like pretending to be poor, eating like each other's food. I mean, like like eating out of trash cans is something you do when you think you're gonna die. It's not like something that like it's not something working class people do. You know what I'm saying? It's not something that like, or even like the working poor do. It's not something you do unless you're about to fucking die. And so like, I mean, the whole
yeah, I mean, I don't know. You've spent some time here in Portland, no? Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's an odd kind of like radical chic, I think, that happens in a lot of places. And I don't want to downplay a lot of stuff like this, but I think that dumpster diving is a real sort of kind of movement amongst kinds of anarchist radical circles and stuff like that, and it sort of plays into some of that's a little bit at Reed and stuff like that, but yeah, I mean, amongst like my community, like that asco, man, we the trash is the trash and it stays there. You don't go looking for it unless you're like you have no resources and no one in your community, right? You're about to die because in when I was growing up, if you needed something, you could turn to neighbors, you could turn to family. There were other sorts of things to do before you had to do something like that. And so for rich people to play at dumpster diving was always a little bit odd to me, because it wasn't something that, I mean, this was an odd culture for me, because this was not something even I saw with folks who are poor and working class in Albuquerque. That was not something that people did.
Like some community college in Albuquerque or something. No, it's gonna happen some high school in Albuquerque. No, man, like what the fuck are you doing? Anyways, I'm but when I spoke at Reed, it actually started this little habit that I began to do, which I went because they brought me in for that very reason. Because there was this thing about the Western canon, and there was like this group of people like defend the Western canon, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it wasn't even like the resistance to it is where it began. It began with these white students out of nowhere being like defend the Western canon, right? And then that like spawned the like, what the fuck are you talking? Like, what are you talking about? So then that created this whole thing all these students of color fighting against like coalition and stuff like that. So they brought me in to come talk. And the first thing I did is I went to the bookstore, and because the thing that everyone was talking about was be objective, be objective, be objective.
Hmm.
You know, like be objective, objectivity, Western canon, objectivity. So I went there and I found like 4 books that would have to do anything with Latino, with Latinos generally. And there was like one on Latin America broadly. There was one on the Chicano struggle. There was one I think on Puerto Rico, and then there was one I think on El Salvador and the dirty war, the civil war there. And so that was it. And so it was like there was like hundreds of books. So I'm like, wow. So this is objectivity. On the campus you are on, the objectivity is you exist in 4 out of hundreds, if not thousands, of books.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, I think so that was my experience as well. I mean, you might have like a small discussion about Latin America, some of the history courses or something rather like that. I mean, one of the things that they've been trying to do is change up this curriculum, right? On the entering freshman class every year, there's this Humanities 110 class that everyone has to take, and it's supposed to sort of immerse you in sort of Western culture and Western ideals, and it's based on sort of the great books kind of program at University of Chicago and at Stanford and things like this. And so there's been big struggle about that over the years, and in the past, like say 5 years or so, I think the students finally got the faculty to focus on talking about different major cities around the world. And so the course now is based on studying Athens in Greece, and then Rome in the Roman Empire, and then the Harlem Renaissance. So you read some stuff about African Americans, and then they decided to add Tenochtitlan, right, and talking about the Nahua Empire there. And so I don't know where that's gone, and I don't know how they're doing it, but they recognize that they need to do something. They just have been so immersed in this great books program for so many years that I think it's really hard to sort of open up the canon. And I think that this is still a side of struggle, not only in higher education but in public schools. I mean, the ways in which different school boards choose their textbooks and what they include or don't include. This is the same struggle going on in education throughout all levels in the United States. And I mean, and I think that it's my entry point into this was always with the Chicano movement. You know, when I sort of became familiar with the sort of thinking of the Chicano movement was sort of like in the late 70s, early 80s. And at that time, it was Chicana feminists critiquing what had gone on in the movimiento. So my entry point into Chicanismo was always like the kind of holy trinity of Shori Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, Ana Castillo, right? Elizabeth Betita Martinez, right? It was these feminist women who were trying to articulate why the early movimiento was indeed sexist, homophobic, and all these kinds of things, but not giving up on the movement, trying to sort of enrich the discussion about what it meant to be Chicanx. And then also, like, what's the place of the Mexican-American community in the United States and in the world, and this kind of vision of a better place that we could try to create. And so that was my sort of entryway into Chicanismo. And I think that those struggles were also about like identity, like who are we in this nation state of the United States? Who are we in relationship to Mexico? Who are we in relationship to our indigenous brothers and sisters, cousins, ancestors? So it was this kind of discussion of who we are. And I mean, I think that this is the big national discussion going on for lots of folks, even for white folk now. I mean, I think that the Trump administration and the rise of the sort of MAGA movement is a reaction to a deep fear of white Americans of not knowing who they are, and the sense of loss that they're feeling because of this kind of cultural identity. And so I think that you know, the kinds of questions that the Chicano movement was asking about who we are relevant now in a much broader scene. And we're seeing the kind of violence that can come out of people who are frustrated by having a sense of not knowing their place in the world.
Yeah. So I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit. You're talking about you know, your role in the Chicano movement and Chicano struggle and Chicano movement kind of bringing you know, that being your focus, but you're doing it through like kind of philosophical lens. And it seems like so much of when you talk about the movement, kind of fall in these kind of two categories, right? Like either be like you're kind of like kind of a statistician, kind of like a very like, you know, materialist boots on the ground, dirt on your fingernails, you're out there organizing and fighting with the people, like that kind of thing. Or there's like a spiritual awakening, like there's like this like kind of like reconnecting to the ancestors in the past, etc., so forth. This restoration, reclaiming our indigenous selves, sort of thing. So it seems like a lot of what could be categorized as philosophy, what could be categorized as philosophical, like looking at these old philosophical texts, is instead almost universally categorized as spirituality, or as like decolonial reclamation of spirituality. So like, yeah, it seems like it would be very frustrating. Can you talk a little bit about like how much of what we look at, I mean, it may be, I mean, things can be both things, right? But how much of what we look at as like just like the spiritual awakening is actually classic philosophical text from our own community?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so I'll talk a little bit about like what I've done, and this is something that I tried to do with my first book. So my first book is called Cesar Chavez and the Common Sense of Nonviolence. And so one of the other things that I'm really interested is a work that's in the field called peace studies, peace and nonviolence studies, which looks at questions of peace, justice, nonviolence, and social movement theory. And as I was saying, I've always really been interested in the history of the Chicano movement, and one of the sort of big figures in that was always Cesar Chavez. And so early on in my career, I was really interested in trying to figure out, like, well, what was Cesar Chavez about? Like, why was he a figure that so many people admired, and what were his ideas of nonviolence? And so, my first book is an attempt to try to show that what Cesar Chavez did was he offered a notion of nonviolent social struggle for social transformation that is similar to, but very importantly different than, folks like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And that perhaps his way of thinking about social change through nonviolence is more relevant, in fact, nowadays than either of those two thinkers. And so, whenever in nonviolence studies and in peace and justice studies, whenever people talk about nonviolence, right, the big sort of figures are always Gandhi and King, but they ignore Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and all that kind of stuff. So my first book was an attempt to try to figure out, like, what was the philosophy behind Cesar Chavez's nonviolence? And what I tried to do is to try to show that I think that he offers a kind of vision of social change that's more realistic than Gandhi, but also I think is better attuned to the idea of like day-to-day, everyday organizing, getting in the faces of people, getting into the streets and doing that kind of hard organizing work that you're talking about. This is something that Dr. King started to realize and think that was important for the civil rights movement to do, but he came upon that realization really late, in about 1967, 1968. I think in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, he finally acknowledges, look, we need to change and shift the civil rights movement away from reacting to nonviolence to be able to start thinking about how we build alternatives to the dominant society and to capitalism in particular. And he started to think about ways of organizing to do that, but it was, he got killed right as he's starting to think about that. And I think that part of what Chavez was doing, in some sense, from the very get-go, was thinking about not only how to react against injustice, but also how to create alternative institutions that would build a different and better kind of world that would react against corporate materialism, corporate greed and interest, and also change our political institutions. So I think that Chavez was a really kind of important figure for social change that gets largely ignored. Or people, if they think about Chavez, it's sort of like the way in which we think about Martin Luther King Jr. It's like, oh, he was a really important figure. He was a saint. No one can be like him. And he did some really important stuff, but and he didn't like violence. And so that's about the extent that a lot of people know about him. But right, what I tried to do is to say that if we look at his speeches and we look at his writings, we find a really active thinker. I call him a community intellectual, right, in the book, someone who came to have some really profound ideas and reflections about social change, but ones that were in dialogue with communities and that we're responding to the needs of communities. So it's kind of like that Paulo Freirean idea of the the dialogue as important for the oppressed in order to understand their own oppression, the Gramscian notion of the organic intellectual that sort of gains knowledge from struggle. I think that that's what was going on with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta as they're starting to build the United Farm Workers in the 1960s, and then later on throughout the 60s and 70s. And so that's what I wanted to capture in my first book. And so part of that, I think, is that it's trying to say, look, these figures that we know from the Chicano movimiento, like Cesar Chavez, like Jorge Gonzalez, and Jose Angel Gutierrez, and Elizabeth Betita Martinez, these folks were in struggle. They were organizing, but they were also writing and talking and thinking and trying to get their eyes out in terms of thinking about a different kind of world. And there's a lot of resources there, I think, for going into their work to trying to see, like, what is the kind of vision for collective struggle and for social change that we can find in it. That's the sort of vision of our world. And I think that a lot of that stuff has been neglected, largely because, we've focused on, and not to criticize this, I think it's important to focus on the literature, the poetry, and also to have the kind of statistician kind of social science focus on our struggles. But we also need, I think, some kind of sense of being able to explain what our values are, and to ourselves and to other people, to see how we might be able to make connection for more solidarity for social struggle. And I think one person who's done this really well is the historian Paul Ortiz, who I think and his work on the Latinx and Black history, he admits, has been really influenced by the kind of vision of Elizabeth Martinez. Right. And so Paul Ortiz is someone who I think I really admire him, because he sort of is looking for inspiration for how to think about the world, how to think about history from this kind of Chicano perspective. And this is something that I hope that I'm doing in the field of philosophy.
Yeah. So, in the field of philosophy, it's very interesting. You're talking about Cesar Chavez, who's this kind of looming figure of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
And whatever people think about him, he's a looming figure of the 20th century. It's a time period that we don't associate with philosophers.
Yeah.
We don't, right? So it's kind of it seems like you have a twin struggle here. You have a double trouble. You got a double struggle. In that, in the one hand, you're talking about a society of philosophers, and philosophy is so often treated as something that happened, in Greece, and then maybe during the Industrial Revolution there were a couple philosophers worth note. There was some during the French Revolution, American Revolution, but that was these little pockets of time in Europe, and that's philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And this other stuff is something else entirely, right? It's not that it's not even that it's not worthy of study or interest, but that's not philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy is something that happened a long time ago, and then even if it wasn't that long ago, it only happened over here. This one guy, this one room, and he's really mad at his mother or something, Nietzsche or something, and that's right. That. Yeah. And then philosophy is not something. Philosophy is not ongoing. It's this thing that happened and we study it.
Right.
And then on the other hand, the idea that there is Mexican philosophy is also a very faux pas in the United States. So how do you fight these things simultaneously? I mean, this one just general conception that exists amongst us all, right? The philosophy is something that happened and we study. That's not unique to white Americans or Anglos or whatever. That idea, and then the idea that they're Mexican philosophy. What are you even talking about? How do you fight those things simultaneously?
Yeah, this is for real. I mean, I think that one of the things that I often think is really interesting is that I think our gente, our community, Mexican Americans in particular in the United States, there's a kind of focus on a certain kind of pragmatism, right? When parents send their children to school, like I see here at Oregon State University, right? It's like go there to get a job, become an engineer, become a pharmacist, right? Do something important so that you can take care of yourself. And so there's a real kind of focus in our communities on doing stuff that's going to pay off and be practical. And so very few Latinx students are going to sort of wander into the philosophy office and try to figure out how to become a major there. And my colleagues in philosophy, from SMAP, the Society for Mexican American Philosophy, we talk about this all the time, about how one of the struggles is to try to show that, one, philosophy, right, the sort of 3,000-year-old practice in Western European history, that can be useful for helping to think about how to live today, but also that that's not the only kind of philosophy, that there is this whole other kinds of worlds of philosophy and ways of thinking, and that they exist in many cultures, including Latin American societies and including amongst Latinx communities. And so it's an important kind of struggle. You have to sort of open up views about what philosophy means. So it's not just the dude in the white dude in the robe with the long beard, but that there's whole histories of folks going back to the Aztec, the Nahua, right? When I teach Latin American philosophy, right, I begin by not looking at the Greeks or thinking about those kinds of folks. I think about the Nahuas of Tenochtitlan, and we spend a lot of time sort of exploring the ways in which their ways of life and their worldview were complicated, rich meditations on thinking, and that they had realizations that we realize about life, that life can be hard, life can be struggle, life is full of suffering, and they figured out ways to try to overcome it. And so that they weren't like these half-naked savages running around in the jungle killing each other and sacrificing each other to gods that were bloodthirsty, that those kinds of things were interpretations that were put on them by an invading people. But once you start to look at their own sources and to study their own words, you find a much richer world that has a much sort of bigger picture about how to live as a human being here on this earth. And once you sort of pull out that picture, you start to say, and notice this is very similar to what was going on in places like Greece or in China or in India. So that philosophy is not something that was born in Greece, though the name comes from there, but the inspiration, the impulse to think about the world and to think about humanity and our role in it is a kind of universal thing, right? It's a universal human thing. Yeah, right, to think about our relationship to the world, right? Yeah. The divine, all of that stuff, that's the human condition. And part of what the problem is that the reason why we think that the Greeks were the end all and be all and the only ones we're studying is because that was the colonial imperialist project to destroy and to ignore any other ways of thinking about how to be human. And so we have to recognize that when we can only think about that, it's because ideologically we have been brainwashed to think that Europe and the Greeks and the Romans are the sort of pinnacle of human wisdom. And part of that is what we need to explode, not only in philosophy, but I think in other sorts of fields as well, right? And so I think that there's a big decolonial project to be done in higher education to sort of show that there are sources of wisdom in other communities other than the white European strain. And that's what I think that we do, is to try to sort of, you have to be familiar with things like, I had to educate myself entirely in Nahua thought, right? I never took a class on this. I've had to sort of educate myself to sort of be able to talk about this.
Yeah.
But like the other sort of thing I wanted to say is that when I teach, like, my basic intro to political philosophy, I don't begin with the Greeks. I mean, I used to when I started off, because I thought too that that's where we should start, by thinking about ideas about democracy and justice and things like that. But I started to realize that's an imperialist colonial way of teaching. And I don't want to tell that story anymore. So I actually begin with Mesopotamia and the Egyptians, Phoenicians, and the Greeks come later. But I want to show that the origins of thinking about origins about thinking about justice and how to be fair are something that come from somewhere else other than Europe or the Greeks. That this is the human condition of trying to think about how to be fair and true to one another. I think that this impulse to solidarity and cooperation is truly the way that human beings are. So I'm a big fan of anarchist thought. So Pyotr Kropotkin, right? Cooperation is really what human nature is about.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I know, I completely agree with you. But the other struggle is getting people to think that like philosophy is an ongoing living thing as opposed to something that is dead in the past. And that isn't just about, Anglo or white or the great white canon. I mean, that's everybody. I mean, nobody thinks philosophy is something that's still going on. So how do you
Yeah.
fight?
Well, I mean, I think the thing to do is to show that that there's ongoing discussion about how communities around the world are thinking about the same sorts of problems. I mean, I think that in the United States, we have a really rich tradition, for instance, of African American thought and Black philosophy. Black philosophers, I think, are in the United States are still a very small minority of the overall sort of makeup of philosophers, but have a really rich tradition of colloquia, books, authors, and people who are really well established in creating this kind of intellectual tradition of African American thought and philosophy. And I think that amongst Latinx, and particularly amongst Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx folks, we haven't had that long of a history to establish our kind of canon of thinkers. And so I think there's this ongoing work to try to sort of show that, look, our folk have been working to think about what it means to be an American, what it means to think about living in this kind of white imperialist project, what are different alternatives for thinking about things. And so I think that part of it is just going to show that, there are these other ways of thinking about what philosophy is about, but that also there are communities that we are not just problem communities. They're not just folks that we study because, oh, farm workers are poor or whatever, right? It's that there's also collective wisdom from generations of living and having to react to oppression that create sources of wisdom and unique cultural formations that can help us to think about the problems of how to live as humanity, right? And so I think that there's an ongoing struggle to sort of make philosophy be relevant, right, to ongoing lives, and not just something that it's a matter of studying the Greeks. And so I think that students are often not very interested in philosophy because they think it's just studying a bunch of dead white men. But part of it is that that's the unfortunate kind of effect of imperialism and colonialism. And I think that our struggle is to try to sort of show that the legacy of thinking about what it means to be human belongs to us all.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of your so now we're gonna get to the fun part of the conversation. So you have taken enormous interest, or it's part of who you are in that grand philosopher. Oh man, I'm blanking his name. Gene Roddenberry.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gene Roddenberry. Yeah, Star Trek. So tell us about your interest in Star Trek and how'd you get interested? First of all, tell us about your like I'm a little boy, I'm watching Star Trek. Tell us how you first got interested in Star Trek, and then get into how that's made its way into your work.
All right, yeah, so this again, like I owe everything to like my mother, right? And so my interest in Latin America, my interest in philosophy, but also my interest in Star Trek. I mean, I remember we used to watch on Sunday nights on KOB TV after the news came on in Albuquerque. We would sit and watch the old original series of Star Trek in reruns on Sunday nights together. And so Star Trek for me was always this thing that I did with my mom, and we would watch these shows. And I would always, the original series always had these kinds of big themes sometimes that were like, about our place in the universe and like our relationships with non-humans and all these kind of stuff. And I was often sitting there thinking, wow, this is really deep. As a little kid, I'm thinking, I don't know what to think about these problems. Like, what if we go back in time, if we could change things? What would we change? And right, what does it mean to meet aliens and to expand the universe and all that? So these were things that sort of really stuck with me. And, and I also grew up watching, Star Wars. And for so many years of my adult life, I thought, hey, this is just a geeky kind of thing that I shouldn't talk about with my colleagues, and it's just a hobby. But in the past, say 10 years or so, I've started to realize, no, science fiction is actually really important. That's what science fiction tries to help us to do, is to use our imagination to think about different kinds of worlds and better kinds of worlds.
Yeah.
And so that there's a kind of what I call a utopian impulse in there, or even a kind of a radical imagination. I mean, there's a lot of science fiction that's just crap, and it's like militaristic imperial stuff that's just about conquering other. I mean, this early science fiction is always about like the fear of aliens who are trying to take us over, or we have to destroy Planet X or something or other. So, you know, or
Cold War, a lot of that stuff.
yeah, a lot of that is reactions to those kinds of things. But starting in, I think, in the 1960s, there was this kind of what's called the new wave of science fiction, of a lot of different authors who were interested in using science fiction in different kinds of ways. And so one of my favorite authors, Ursula K. Le Guin, is part of that movement. But also Gene Roddenberry brings this kind of impulse, I think, to network television. And you know, what's going on there is he wanted to create a show that would talk about this future that was one in which humanity had conquered racism, sexism, economic inequality. There was no more war, and that there were still going to be interesting kinds of problems for humanity to face, even though we had overcome all those problems that were plaguing our society now. And so he was trying to create this kind of, you know, utopia out there, a future of a different kind of world, and try to show us that things could be different. And so I've started to think about this in some kinds of ways, and I think that I've tied this into sort of other sorts of readings, like I've done in Kropotkin, in early sort of histories of justice thinking, going all the way back to Mesopotamia. That I think Roddenberry sort of is tying into this kind of human impulse that we have the capacity as a species within us to be able to work, to solve problems together, to be in solidarity with one another. You know, we shouldn't give in to the impulse that everything is about Lord of the Flies, and, you know, that our human instinct is to be competitive and self-interested and to destroy ourselves. That's not really who we are. And so I think that what I've been doing a lot of in the past few years is trying to find out ways in which to talk about science fiction stories that emphasize this radical imagination, this idea that we can think about how to live differently.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one of my favorite quotes by Ursula Le Guin is this idea. This was in 2017, I think, in her National Book Award. She said, look, for thousands of years, a paraphrase, you know, for thousands of years, people thought that the divine right of kings was the only way to go, right? But that sort of way of thinking, that, you know, the powers that be are there because the God or God wants them to be there, that went away. And so capitalism now, for instance, seems to be the only way to organize our economic systems. But anything that's made by human beings can be unmade by them as well. There's nothing natural about capitalism. It's not like the structure of the atom. It's something that we created, and that people who keep it in power now are there. It's there for certain people's benefit. And we have to ask, who benefits from the structures of power that we have? And are there different ways of thinking about how we could do this that don't exclude and immiserate so many people? And so I think that for me, science fiction has been this kind of this early sort of hope and inspiration for thinking about how to live in a different kind of place and a different kind of world. But also, you know, I think it's tied to these notions of social struggle and transformation. And so I've been seeing a lot of different people who are thinking about science fiction in this kind of way: Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, Kim Stanley Robinson, my colleague here in Oregon, Walida Imarisha, who is someone you should interview, by the way. If you don't know her, you should touch into her. She is really interested in this kind of question about how to think about science fiction as a tool for liberation. And so I think that this is the kind of thing that I've been doing in the past few years. And so a few years ago, a colleague of mine and I created this thing that we call the Anares Project for Alternative Futures. And the Anares is comes from one of Ursula Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed, where she tried to envision what an anarchist society would look like. And so Anares is this moon that is run in an anarchist system. According to anarchist principles. And so we call ourselves the Anares Project. But part of what we try to do is to think about and offer talks and encourage projects that think about social transformation, and sometimes from this kind of science fiction standpoint. And so the part of this work came from the work that my colleague Tony Vogt and I were doing with the Occupy movement here in Corvallis in 2010. And we wanted to try to figure figure out a way to bring the insights and the activists and the wisdom that was being generated by, sort of that social struggle onto the university, and to encourage people to think about new forms of social change. And so we created this project, and we called it that because we both love science fiction. And so what we're doing now is, we've always sort of inspired talks about social change, social activism, social movements, but we've been putting heavy focus lately on these kinds of the ways in which science fiction can be a tool for helping us to envision better worlds. And so I've been doing this this blog, theanarisproject.org, and since we've been sort of in quarantine, started a YouTube channel in which we are doing this thing that we call Trek Wars. It's a project that we started about 3 years ago, where we talk about how things like Star Wars and Star Trek can help us to think about things like social change, the role of women in society. This last one that we did virtually this year that's up on our YouTube channel is, villains. Like, what do the villains of Star Trek and Star Wars tell us about things like what it means to be evil? Who are the sources of evil in our society today? And, what does power mean? What is the kind of power that villains have over us in the world? And so, we will go back and forth between talking about like Darth Maul and Darth Vader to Donald Trump and corporations and Nike. And so we go all over the place. So it's kind of a geek fest in some kinds of ways, but we try to sort of bring it back to these kinds of questions of like, what are we learning from science fiction about our current political and economic situation? And what are we learning from science fiction so that we can change those things, so that we can actually then be enlivened to struggle?
No, so can you tell us a little about the philosophy of the Prime Directive?
Well, Star Trek is this thing, my students often, right, Generation Z doesn't know Star Trek very much as well as they know Star Wars. And we go always back and forth in our Trek Wars kinds of gatherings to talk about, like, what's the difference between the ways in which these franchises talk about ethics and what's right and wrong. And so, Star Trek for me is this. I think that this is what I've said before, is that even when I talk with my students nowadays and I ask them, what do you think we as human beings are really like? They have these really sort of negative views. A lot of them do, that we are these awful creatures, that our self-destruction is inevitable, that the apocalypse is coming. There's not much we can do about it because we're so shitty as creatures and beings. And there's very little beauty in our lives. And it's all about sort of competition and self-interest. And there are those who think that competition and self-interest is great because it's the foundation of capitalism, and they really want to make their way through that kind of way of life. So, I think that part of what I see with my students a lot is that their imagination of who we are and what is possible for the future is often very constrained by the kinds of dystopian stories that have come out in, say, the past 20 years. We know all the bad stories: Black Mirror, right? Handmaid's Tale, Hunger Games, all these stories about like authoritarian worlds, or, this is the stuff that gets eaten up in pop culture and that's really popular. And stories that try to talk about something different than that are very rare. So we are in this moment where we're just fascinated by dystopian ways of thinking. And, in my students nowadays, under the sort of pandemic, I've seen that I think that a lot of these stories have really handicapped our imaginations in some ways, is because my students are so scared, like everybody, but they're so scared because they don't think that there's anything that we can do to make the world better. And I think it's because we've just been boiling in these kinds of stories. And so I think that for me, the Star Trek story is one that recognizes that that's a component of who we are, but that's not the whole story, right? And that we are capable of being able to do much better things. I mean, the Star Trek world, right, to geek on you a little bit, right, the world of Captain Kirk and Spock and all that stuff doesn't happen until there's World War III. And before that, there is these genetic superhumans that take over the world and put everyone under their control, right? And so, from a period of about like 1960 to the early 22nd century in the Star Trek world is a period of suffering, of war, of destruction, of almost human extinction. But we learn how to get over that. And then what happens is Kirk and Spock and McCoy. And so for a lot of folks, right, a lot of my students, when they look at things like Star Trek, they say, this is so corny because that world is so unlike where we are today. And what I tell students is, well, you have to understand that that was an accomplishment through a lot of death and struggle and almost the near extinction of the human race. That's the backstory to that world. And so the reason why it looks so cool, the reason that there's no racism and classism and war, is because the story is we've tried to learn to overcome that because it almost killed us. And so I think once you sort of think about that backstory, you start to think, oh, well, maybe it's possible that we can do something different. Maybe that capitalism isn't inevitable. Maybe that racism isn't inevitable. How do we do that? And those are the kinds of, those sparks can start to create, ways of thinking about social change. And so I think that that's why I turned to Star Trek for this kind of work, because I think that dystopian thoughts are important to give us warnings about what we should be watching out for, but they can also inhibit us thinking that change is possible.
So, Reagan used "Born in the USA," song about the Vietnam War, in his campaign. Trump actually, I think someone must have told him quickly not to do that, but he was actually for a really brief period of time using "Keep on Rocking in the Free World," a song about homelessness,
right,
as his campaign thing to look cool. But more recently, before the pandemic, the biggest thing in the story in the news was the Space Force.
Yeah.
Which Trump used the Star Trek logo in his thing. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big backstory. I mean, so this is, I mean, for those folks who don't know, right? This is the Star Trek Delta. And so it appears there's a very similar kind of thing that's appearing now in the Space Force insignia. It's a weird thing. I mean, it turns out that the military didn't steal that from Star Trek, that there's an older kind of design going back to the 1950s that uses a kind of delta shape in it. And that it turns out that it might have been Star Trek that kind of molded that, taking it from NASA and that NASA. So there was this weird kind of synergy going on. But I mean, I think that, right, I saw the first recruiting video for Space Force the other day, and it was really interesting, right? It's this, there's this voiceover, and this person standing on a hillside or something, or they're looking at all the stars, and the last thing is the voiceover says something like, maybe you've realized that the problems that you've been made to save don't exist here on Earth, but in the stars. Right. And so it's just kind of like, wow, right, that sounds cool. I want to join Space Force too.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I think, the military has always sort of posed itself as like, be all you can be, or be the force of one, or an army of one, right? It's trying to connect that you can be a better person through involvement in this kind of military institution. And I think that this is something I think that is an impulse that we all have, is trying to meet our full potential and trying to figure out how to do that. I think that science fiction, I think philosophy is really about studying the ways in which we've tried to talk about how it is that we can try to achieve our full human potential. But this kind of need, this kind of interest often gets manipulated for these imperial projects. So that's what I think is going on in Space Force.
Yeah. Fucking horrible. All right. So, Joy, where can people connect your work? Where can people find out more about what you're doing? Some of the things we've been talking about today.
So if folks want to find out more about the kind of stuff that we're doing with science fiction and social change and reflecting on social transformation, they can check out the Anarres Project website, which is Anarres Project, all one word. That's ANARRES project.org. Or you can find us at Anarres Project on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. And so those are all different ways in which you can sort of find our content and get in touch with us and let us know what you're thinking about. And so the YouTube site, or the YouTube channel, is also a NARI's project for alternative futures. And so that's a new thing. We'd love to hear what people have to think about the ways in which we're trying to connect science fiction with things like dystopian worldviews, with COVID-19 and the quarantine. So we'd love to hear what people have to say about the way in which we're using this way to analyze our world.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, man.
It's been illuminating. It's been interesting. It's you know.
No, thanks, man. I appreciate that you just bringing all these different voices of social change, and particularly for the Latinx community and for Chicanos in general. So much respect.
Thank you.